should be going live. Okay, there we go. I believe we are live. So hello everyone. Wait, is it working? Sorry, I just want to double check that it is working. Okay, yeah, it is working. So yeah, hello everyone. Today we are discussing, this is a panel discussion about Western philosophy and racism. We are very honoured as the Oxford PPE Society today to have three very distinguished guests with us. Firstly, I'll introduce Professor Charles Mills. He's an expert on political theory centred on class, gender and race, and is the author of the profoundly influential book, The Racial Contract, and more recently, Black Rights and White Wrongs, which has made waves since its publication in 2018. Mills is currently the Distinguished Professor of Philosophy at the Graduate Center, City University of New York in New York City. On a personal note, I would like to add that he's been a philosopher that has been deeply influential on my own academic interests. Reading his works as a non-white person actually did make me feel as though philosophy was something I could pursue to an undergraduate degree at Oxford. So I just want to say thank you for that.
I hope you don't reproach me for that later.
And then I'd also like to introduce Professor Anita L Allen, who is currently the Henry R. Silverman Professor of Law and Philosophy at the University of Pennsylvania. Her interests range from contemporary ethics and bioethics to race and race relations. She's been of seminal importance in the discussion surrounding Western philosophy and its racism, since she posed a challenge to Western philosophy with the question of what value does Western philosophy actually hold for Black women? And lastly, but certainly not least, I'd like to introduce Professor Bryan Van Norden, who is the James Monroe Taylor Chair in Philosophy at Vassar College and the Chair Professor of Philosophy in the School of Philosophy at Wuhan University in China. He's an expert on Chinese philosophy and has written extensively about the Western reception to non-Western philosophical traditions. In 2017, he published Taking Back Philosophy, a Multicultural Manifesto, which has been an important recent contribution to the topic we are discussing today. So again, I just want to say thank you to everyone for joining us. So I suppose the best place to start with this panel discussion about Western philosophy and racism is to perhaps sort of like set the boundaries of the discussion. And I guess the best place to start is, what do we mean by Western philosophy? So this is a question initially for Bryan. Could you possibly outline what we mean by Western philosophy? As I think it is a fairly nebulous term. For example, is it just the analytic tradition, or is it sort of also the continental tradition? Clarifying what we mean by Western philosophy, I think, is quite important to the actual discussion.
Well, thank you. That's a great question. One way of thinking about it is in terms of the Anglo-European tradition. So the tradition of philosophy that goes back through Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And in a way, this tradition is already been multicultural. The tradition originally didn't invidiously distinguish between philosophy that went back to Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle and other traditions. That's a later development. But you have this tradition which goes back to Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, and then through the Romans. And it includes the Abrahamic traditions, so the traditions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. It includes thinkers who live in Europe of various religions and what later were classified as various races. And it includes both the analytic and the continental traditions. And within the Anglo-European tradition, there are sub-traditions that even now are subject to discrimination or are slighted including LGBTQ philosophy, feminist philosophy, Latinx philosophy, African-American philosophy, and so on. But in my work, what I've become especially concerned about and what I've tried to address is the fact that although when the Anglo-European tradition became aware of other philosophical traditions, initially the tradition was often open-minded about them. So when people like Leibniz found out about Chinese philosophy, Leibniz was effusive about how exciting and interesting Chinese philosophy was. And many early modern European thinkers were very excited about South Asian philosophy. However, with the rise of pseudoscientific racism and Western imperialism, people developed rationalizations that only the philosophy that goes back through Plato, Aristotle, and Socrates is genuine philosophy. And they claim that people of other races and people in other parts of the world who gradually came to be color-coded by race, that was a later development, were genetically incapable of doing philosophy. So, but it's important to recognize that if you actually bother to look outside the Anglo-European tradition, you'll find out that there's a vibrant philosophical tradition going back thousands of years in South Asia, including India. There's a vibrant philosophical tradition going back thousands of years in East Asia, including China. There are vibrant philosophical traditions in Africa and in indigenous American thought. And so now it's almost impossible, at least in the United States, and from what I understand of my colleagues in the UK and in Europe, almost impossible to study philosophy in these other traditions in mainstream philosophy departments. But it wasn't always that way. It was a decision to exclude these other traditions from the canon. So that's a form of systematic racism that I've become particularly concerned about as a specialist in Chinese philosophy, and that I tried to combat.
Charles or Anita, do you feel so you have anything to add?
Yes, certainly I think Bryan makes, some really good points. And a book that, very controversial in its time, the furore has somewhat died down now. But very relevant to this discussion is Martin Bernal's book, Black Athena. Mm-hmm. And of course, his original claim was that we have this imagery of the Greek tradition, sort of springing from its own brow. And Athens and these city-states, they're lifted out of the Mediterranean, Afro-Asiatic complex and all the cultural influences that were there. And the claim, of course, as everybody knows, was very controversial in its time. I think the overall scholarly judgment has been that he did not ultimately make the case, but the original case was that Athens really got the sort of crucial ideas from ancient Egypt, and ancient Egypt was in certain respects, Bernal is more hedged on this than some Black scholars, but in certain respects what we'd call a Black civilization or elements of that. But in terms of the other point that Bryan was making, Bernal makes points out as well that originally, say in the 16th century and so forth, there is this openness to recognition, these other civilizations. And then there's, what Bernal calls, remember rightly, the Aryan model. So the Aryan model comes in the consolidation of racism, scientific racism, and it then means that it's sort of linked with genealogies, so that if you could draw an analogy, if you think of racial purity as an ideal within, let's say, Nazi Germany or the Old South, and the importance of making sure you're not contaminated by Blackness above all, of course, but desirably, not by other elements also. So there's a kind of genealogical equivalent that you want your philosophy to sort of trace its bloodlines back. I mean, the whole concept is absurd, of course, but within this sort of, organized absurdity that is racism. So you can't allow for these influences from these other civilizations, because it then means you're not getting the real thing. And of course, linked with that is a denial that what these people are doing is really philosophy in the first place. And it then sort of, is is put on a lower status. And as Bryan points out, we're still living with this now. So Bernal sort of traces the shift from what he calls the Aryan model to a sort of later, more seemingly liberal concept, but it's still a revised Aryan model. There's sort of still crucial elements of the original there. And you could say that in philosophy in that period now, in that nobody is going to be saying openly, well, these Chinese, these Indian, these native people, they're really stupid, they don't have the intellectual capacity to do philosophy. But if you look at practices, if you look at institutions, if you look at how the lines are drawn, because so much in a discipline, in any discipline, so much can be inferred from how the lines are drawn, where the boundaries are put in place. You could say that, we're still living with that now in terms of what is seen as real philosophy. And then there are these particular niche interests. So if students want to pursue that, okay, you can do a course in that, but come on, we know where the real action is.
Yes, and I would just like to add to that, the term Western philosophy, which we're setting about to try to define, it's not in the 21st century a neutral term where it might be opposed to, say, Eastern philosophy or African philosophy, where they all these terms are equivalent. Western philosophy has a definitely it's a term of appreciation, a term of superiority. So Western philosophy is still being conveyed to students as a tradition that maybe begins with certain pre-Socratic philosophers like Heraclitus, but we go from our Plato, our Aristotle, Cicero, Augustine, Aquinas, Machiavelli, Descartes, Locke, Berkeley, Hume, Kant, Heidegger, Husserl, Sartre, Quine, Wittgenstein, Hartdorf, and Rawls, that whole line of thinking that is completely male, first of all, and it only represents thinkers from a few countries of the world. And so we have to be, begin this conversation about racism and racist thinking in relationship to philosophy. It's still the case that the very term Western philosophy is loaded. It has a presumptively positive valence by contrast to inferior philosophies of countries where the thinking is that their philosophy is more of a cultural matter. It's religion, it's culture, it's not deep logical systematic thinking, which we of course know is not true at all. But that's, I think, the way it's often portrayed. So from the very beginning of even the assertion of the word Western philosophy, we're already, in a sense, freighted in our brains with this notion that this tradition is somehow where it's all at. It's the most important tradition, and it's the most sophisticated, and we have to fight that at every line, every stage.
Good.
Add to that?
Yeah.
That great comment. I was sometimes, I don't know if the rest of you have this experience, but sometimes people say, well, Bryan, why do you have to discuss this in terms of structural racism? Isn't it just a matter of ignorance? And personally, I respond to a couple ways to that. One is to remind us that, and this is related to the point that Charles was making, not just Martin Bernal's Black Athena deals with this issue about the origins of Western philosophy, but Peter K.J. Park, a more recent work, which I think is very solid scholarship about the history of Western philosophy. He points out that up until about the end of the 18th century, there were three dominant views about the origin of philosophy in European philosophy textbooks. The first view was that philosophy had its origin in Africa, and from Africa, philosophy came to ancient Greece. The second view was that philosophy had its origin in South Asia, India, and from India, it came to ancient Greece. Now, I'm sure you can imagine what the third view is. The third view is that philosophy developed independently in both Africa and South Asia, and both of them gave it to ancient Greece. The view that philosophy developed uniquely in ancient Greece was a weird kind of fringe view in European philosophy textbooks up until about the end of the 18th century. It's only with the rise of pseudoscientific racism and imperialism that people like Kant, and I love many aspects of Kant's philosophy. I'm not saying to throw out all Anglo-European philosophy, but it's with Kant and the Kantians that the philosophy textbooks get rewritten, and China and India and other cultures get written out of the philosophy curriculum. Now then, when I say this, people say, well, but that was a long time ago. Surely you're not accusing anybody of racism today. And one of the things I say is, imagine a colleague who said that she was doing research on this Swiss school of philosophy that was fascinating but very understudied. Can you imagine anyone saying, the Swiss never had philosophy? I mean, don't get me wrong, I love Swiss cheese and cuckoo clocks, but the Swiss, you don't understand, the Swiss just, you know, it's great and everything, but the Swiss can't produce philosophy. No one would ever say that. But you say you're working on Chinese philosophy, the reaction you get is, oh, that's just, it's all aphorisms, right? As if Wittgenstein, there were never any Western philosophers who wrote in the form of aphorisms. And by the way, most of Chinese philosophy is not in the form of aphorisms anyway. So, and then I've told people that there's all this rich philosophy in China, that I study it. There's rich philosophy in India. I have colleagues who study it and I've read it, so I know it's real. And then they'll still say, yeah, but it's not any good, right? How do you know it's not any good if you haven't studied it? And so that's why I say this is systematic racism. It's not enough to say we just don't know about philosophy in these traditions. We in the West, in the European tradition, and I'm of European descent, we did know, and then we wrote it out of the curriculum. And now when you try to write it back in, people tell you it doesn't exist, even when you give them examples of it. So that's why I think talking about it in terms of racism is entirely appropriate. Sorry for yapping so much.
No. Valuable points for sure.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, good. I think we've sort of like got a good handle then on like what we mean by Western philosophy and like what it sort of means for Western philosophy to be racist. I now sort of want to move on to sort of like, I mean, I suppose we have touched upon this with Bryan and his discussion, but especially for Charles and Anita, if you could both initially with Charles, if you could both just outline why exactly you think Western philosophy is racist, or like what elements of Western philosophy you think are racist. So Charles, yeah.
Yes, sure. So there are various definitions of racism that it has, in fact, within critical philosophy of race, that has been an issue, how racism should be defined. So you have the approach which places emphasis on issues of affect and ill will. And then you have the more cognitivist approach, one such I'm sympathetic to myself, as in Thomas Shelby's work, and as I've tried to contribute to. And racism there in terms of a set of beliefs. So, you know, the human race is subdivided into different races, and there's a hierarchy. So for me, there's sort of two crucial claims. And the sort of, there are different metrics one can use to sort of say what the hierarchy consists of. But the two most important ones, arguably, are the cognitive and the characterological. So the superior race is smarter, the superior race is of better character. So if you sort of work with that definition of racism, then the idea would be that Europeans are basically the smartest race, though you then have, you know, competing varieties of intra-European racism, you know, Europeans fighting over, but who is the smartest of them all? So that historically, this needs to be known better. Historically, within white racism, there's Anglo-Saxonism, so that the Anglo-Saxon race was the world historical, world leading white race. And of course, this is tied up with, you know, the British Empire and sort of joined by the American Empire. But anyway, so in terms of these conceptions, the idea would be the hierarchy comes out of the fact that philosophy is a high IQ enterprise. I mean, this, of course, you know, before, you know, the whole apparatus of IQ testing has been developed, but it's a high intelligence enterprise, and the people who are best suited to it are those who are intrinsically more intelligent than others. So in a sense, it sort of, you know, follows straightforwardly. If you have a race that's smarter than other races, if there's a discipline such as philosophy, which is more intellectually demanding than other disciplines, it should not be surprising that the people who are best suited to practice it are going to be Europeans, what we call white people, Europeans in Europe, Europeans in the European settler states, and so forth. And then, you know, there's a question of, to what extent, should we even grant the title of philosophy to what these other folks are doing? And of course, as Bryan points out, you get this, they're then sort of relegated to a lower rung on the intellectual ladder. And then it's in terms of overall material processes, this is not an intellectual project being carried out in a vacuum. It's linked to broader global process of European expansionism. So Europeans are going out into the world, what used to be called when I was in high school, voyages of exploration. These days, maybe more voyages of conquest. And the idea is you're creating empires, you're creating European settler states, and you need a normative justification for it. Because this is the same time period, the period of the modern epoch, when equality supposedly emerges as an overarching norm, which is why Jefferson says in the Declaration, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, while the French Revolution has equality as one of its three main slogans. So if equality is this global norm, then what entitles you to be ruling over other people in the British Empire, the French Empire, and the Dutch empires, or indigenous peoples in the European settler states? Well, the obvious answer is it's really equality for those who are deserving of it. George Orwell's famous line from Animal Farm, some people are just more equal than others, and those are white people. So you then get this apparatus of this theorization of racial hierarchy becomes integrated into part of the global rationale, the European subordination of the rest of the planet. So Europeans are superior in all ways, so justifies European rule over these other peoples, and part of that superiority is manifest in the fact that we are the ones best suited to do philosophy, and insofar as you guys can sort of try to manage it, you do need to be aware that you'll never be able to do it as well as we do. But if you are going to do it, make sure you learn the crucial lesson, which is that the lesson of philosophy is that we're the superior ones, and we can trace that superiority back thousands and thousands of years.
Brilliant.
So I think that I would respond by offering maybe 4 specific respects in which one might say that Western philosophy was racist. So one respect might be that it's racist in terms of its content, that the actual ideas put forward in so much of the philosophical traditions that are classically called Western philosophy, the content is often extremely prejudicial, hateful, and harmful toward peoples of color. Just to give one example, the obvious example is that so many philosophers defended the idea of slavery based on the assumption of Black inferiority and white superiority on the basis of myths that Blacks even needed to be subordinated by white people in order to survive, that Blacks willingly accepted slavery as a fair trade for their lack of the inability of self-care and their own awareness of their cultural and moral inferiority. So there's that one respect. So racist in terms of content, the actual ideas and beliefs put forward in the work are racist and racially offensive. A second respect in which Western philosophy can be said to be racist is in terms of the personal racism of its contributors. So one finds examples of specific theorists, whether it's your Heidegger or your Hannah Arendt theorists who are on a very personal level, people who have bias, that characterological racism that Professor Mills was speaking about just a moment ago. A third respect is, and this is to me the most important one really, is in terms of its exclusion. So Western philosophy can be seen as racist in terms of what it doesn't deal with, that it doesn't deal with African thought, South American thought, great swaths of Asian thought, Japanese thought, Indian thought, Indonesian thought, Chinese thought, that African thought. So most of the planet is excluded from the purview of Western philosophy. And that I think is deeply rooted in historical racisms. Inattention to non-Western philosophy and philosopher, narrow definitions of what counts as philosophy. We're on this stream discussion coming to you from Oxford PPE, well, I remember very vividly when I was in graduate school in the 1970s, what was presented to me as the ideal of Western philosophy was Cambridge and Oxford style analytical philosophy. That was what I was supposed to be learning how to do, and to do it as well as I could. But the exclusion of other kinds of philosophy in terms of its methodology and origin is another important form of this exclusionary dimension of the field. Who the jobs in the field go to, that kind of exclusion too. So who do we hire to be philosophers? Well, until very recently, we hired white men to be philosophers, and only in the last decade or two have we seen large numbers of women and people of color entering the discipline of philosophy as teachers and scholars. So again, content's racist, the contributors are racist. The discipline is racist in terms of exclusions of who gets to teach it and do it, what we pay attention to, how we define the subject matter, and how we define the topics of importance. And the fact that Western philosophy has basically disallowed people of color to talk about the very things they care most about is one of the most galling dimensions of the racist aspects of Western philosophy. And then one final thing, it's a little bit less well formed in my brain, but a fourth kind of racism in Western philosophy is the institutional role that philosophy plays in our institutions and in our country, so that philosophers and philosophy is held up as this sort of example of the humanities at their finest, but yet it's that notion to some extent does injustice to certain other disciplines and people who don't do Western forms of philosophy. So those are some of my thoughts about that. And just to underscore something that was said earlier about how the people who are not white Western philosophers are perceived, that contributes to all of these racisms of content and contribution and so forth. I could just give you my list of beliefs about people of color and non-whites that have made it hard for us to succeed in philosophy or to pursue philosophy or be respected as philosophers, because we're savages and we're inferior and we're weak-minded and we're semi-human and we're prone to criminal conduct and we're morally promiscuous and we're undisciplined and we're childlike, right? We're incapable of self-government. We're weak-minded, especially with the women, the weak-minded and not logical. All of those mythologies about Black and female minds, brown minds, Asian minds, Native American minds has contributed to all the racisms that we see in Western philosophy.
Brilliant, brilliant.
If I could just pick up on Professor Allen's characterization and sort of breakdown of different varieties. If she doesn't mind, she has some great stories of her own that, of course, most Black philosophers are familiar with, because they've read, for example, her interview with George Yancey, one that appeared way back then in 17 Conversations, his first edited book, more recent one in the New York Times. So, some of us are already familiar with them. But for this audience, I think it would be really useful and, very illuminating for Professor Allen to reveal some of the personal experience, as I say, if she doesn't mind, the personal experiences she herself has had. So talk about the racism of philosophy, there's a sort of institutional racism, but there's a personal racism of many white philosophers. So I invite, perhaps presumptuously, Professor Allen to say something about that to the audience. You are not going to believe some of this shit.
Thank you. I will try to weave in some of my outrageous stories of personal degradation in the field as we proceed. I think maybe with respect to the next couple of questions, I'll have an opportunity to do that.
I see. Okay.
Thank you.
Just to make another kind of point then, I think you could add to the list, the very illuminating list of Professor Allen. There's also the question of the particular framework in which certain issues are approached. So there's a sort of outright exclusion on national grounds and ethnic grounds and racial grounds of certain areas. But in addition to that, there's a sort of pattern that you will not necessarily immediately pick up on, especially if you've been socialized in these norms, such as most of us have, because we went to grad school at a time when these were the options. And in some case, and I make a personal confession here, it can be kind of embarrassing to look back and sort of think, why did it take me so long to see the obvious, that this way of looking at things is problematic? And the example I'm going to give comes from the main area I've been working on in recent years, political philosophy, and the question of social justice. And the standard narrative, which I learned in grad school, and for many years, I must confess, sort of passed on to my students, which is that within the Anglo-American tradition, so-called, also seen as analytic philosophy, we have a situation where the main topic in the modern period of normative political philosophy was the question of our obligation to the state. So that in the social contract theorists, for example, you find different views on this, and then there's a sort of competing interpretation coming out of, say, Hume or Hegel and so forth. And then in the mid-50s, the mid-1950s, when mainstream Anglo-American analytic philosophy is moribund, you then get this rebirth, and it's sort of epitomized by the work of John Rawls. And Rawls does various things. He revives Anglo-American political philosophy. He revives, the social contract. And what he does, he switches the main normative topic of political philosophy from the question of our obligation to the state to the question of social justice. So that's the narrative. Rawls is a guy who deserves credit for making the main topic of normative Anglo-American political philosophy social justice. Here's what's wrong with that just so story, which to my shame, mea culpa, I have passed on to my students. I'm trying to do better now. If you look at the African-American political tradition, if you look at people like Kwabena Ottobah-Cugoano, writing way back in 1787, if you look at the long history of Black American theorists, David Walker, Maria Stewart, Frederick Douglass, W.B. Du Bois, Ida B. Wells, coming forward through, like Ralph Ellison, James Baldwin, Andrew Davis, but going back to the earlier period, since there's a Rawlsian narrative that we want to contest. What is the central subject of these folks? Racial injustice. The prime subject of their works is the racial injustice of the United States. Now, these people are English speaking, they're citizens of the United States. By my book, that makes them Anglo-American. So the obvious question then is, and as I say, I sort of beat my breast in guilt. Why didn't I see this before? Why were they not part of the conversation when I was being taught of the sort of crucial theorists of social justice were? Why was there never a thought to think that maybe somebody who was protesting slavery and abolitionists like David Walker might have something useful to say about social justice, or an ex-slave like Frederick Douglass, especially that liberty is supposed to be a central value of the liberal tradition. Surely he might have something worthwhile to say on the subject of liberty, or W.E.B. Du Bois, who has impeccable credentials, even by mainstream racist standards, his PhD from Harvard. Why did it come so naturally to white political philosophers and the journal articles and the surveys and the textbooks they write to exclude all these people? And there's no principled basis for it. Their unavoidable conclusion is it's their blackness. They're addressing the subject of justice and social justice long before Rawls and his disciples are. They're doing it in the English language, but it doesn't come naturally to include them precisely because of the socialization one gets at these institutions. So you develop this tunnel vision, as was pointed out earlier. You get this idea of this tradition going back to ancient Greece, a sort of long chain of white, or well, in the pre-modern period wouldn't have been classified as what would become white links later on, and it's just sort of out of conceptual bounds to bring these other folks in. So that has been one of my belated insights, the extent to which the story we tell about social justice and who deserves credit for shifting the focus of normative political philosophy in the Anglo-American tradition to social justice, who deserves the credit for that, and then linked with that, what is the central theme of these folks? It's corrective justice, because of course they're dealing with a society that's already an unjust one. So the question is, how do we correct for that? And the question we then need to ask ourselves, why is it that in the vast body of work stimulated by the writings of John Rawls, whether those who are sympathetic to him or those who are more critical of him, whether on in sort of liberal spectrum, right and left, or communitarian or critical theorist folks, why is corrective justice as a theme so utterly marginalized? And my suggestion is, and I hope this doesn't sound to people as in a sort of a usual black conspiracy theory. My suggestion is because corrective justice is not, for the most part, a problem for the people who are privileged by the system, white males, and so you get the sidelining of what is arguably the most pressing variety of justice. And part of the irony is you can't say, well, this is some weird black thing or whatever, going back to Africa. Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics makes this formal division, distributive and rectificatory justice. You could not have a more respectable source. Here's your ancient Athens guy, central figure in the tradition. He makes this distinction. This distinction then gets buried in the literature of Rawls onwards. And it's hard, as I say, with my somewhat belated illumination, somewhat belated realization. Wait a minute, how come? This side of the justice debate gets buried because it raises all those questions of correction for social oppression. And if you're a beneficiary of social oppression, which white males in general are, with some qualifications, of course, these are not subjects you want to raise.
I really appreciate the insights Professor Mill is shared with us, and I was vaguely aware of them, but it's very valuable to have them summarized like this. If I can, I'd like to also go back to a point that Professor Allen made about the way in which philosophy can be racist in an exclusionary way. And I just wanted to give a couple of brief quotes, and I apologize for the language of the quotes, but we have to face what the history of philosophy is like.
Absolutely, face it, absolutely.
Yeah, so in his lectures on anthropology, Kant said, quote, "The race of the whites contains all talents and motives in itself. The Hindus have a strong degree of calm and all look like philosophers. That notwithstanding, they are much inclined to anger and love. They thus are educable in the highest degree, but only to the arts and not to the sciences. They will never achieve abstract concepts." In another lecture, Kant ranks the Chinese with the Hindus, and Kant says of the Chinese, "A concept of virtue and morality never entered the heads of the Chinese." And then he says, again, apologies for the language, Kant says, "The race of Negroes is full of affect and passion, very lively, chatty, and vain. It can be educated, but only to the education of servants, i.e. they can be trained." And then he says, "The indigenous American people are uneducable, for they lack affect and passion. They are not amorous and so are not fertile. They speak hardly at all, care for nothing, and are lazy." Now, again, it's easy to say, well, that was Kant, that was a long time ago, and it isn't even one of his more famous works. But the fact is, the neo-Kantians who were influenced by Kant's philosophy, as Peter K.J. Park points out, rewrote the history of philosophy to exclude every tradition other than the one that goes back to Plato, Aristotle, and Socrates. And secondly, let me give you one more quotation. So that you might say, oh, well, that was Kant writing a couple hundred years ago. We're not like that now. This is the recently deceased Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia in his dissenting opinion in Obergefell v. Hodges, the Supreme Court decision that legalized gay marriage in the United States. In the majority opinion, Justice Kennedy cited Confucius on the centrality of marriage as a human institution as part of building a case that it was a violation of the rights of gays and lesbians to deny them the right to get marriage. And in his searing dissenting opinion, Scalia said, "The Supreme Court of the United States has descended from the disciplined legal reasoning of John Marshall and Joseph Story to the mystical aphorisms of the fortune cookie."
Ooh.
So we can draw a line between what Kant says and what Scalia says, And in addition, we can draw a line between what Kant says and the fact that I've tried this. If you ask many philosophy professors today, have you considered offering some courses in Chinese or Indian philosophy or Africana philosophy or Indigenous American philosophy? Their absolute confidence that when they say there is no such thing as Chinese philosophy, there is no such thing as Indian philosophy. And then I always say, have you bothered to read any? Well, no. But they feel confident in saying this. Why? You can trace a direct line back to Kant and the way his neo-Kantian followers rewrote the history textbooks. If I
It's
can
a
show,
synthetic a priori truth.
sorry, I just didn't hear you, Professor Mills.
I'm sorry, it's a synthetic a priori truth that there's no such thing as these philosophers.
Yeah, exactly.
So
Very true.
empirical investigation is not necessary.
Exactly right. Excellent way of putting it. Thank you.
I just want to respond to your Kant quotation in which the quote unquote Negro is best educated to the level of a servant reminded me of one of the stories that I think Professor Mills would like me to tell. But I remember when I just finished my dissertation, I was very proud of myself, and I was meeting with my dissertation advisor, who was a very, at the time, well-known ethics expert, Western ethicist, white male. And he came over to me and he literally put his hand on my chin and lifted my face towards his and said, you know, you look like my family's maid. And it was stunning. I mean, because I think that when I walk into the room as a dark-skinned Black woman, that many people do think, oh, she's the maid or the servant. And a recent experience in my life, which was very hurtful to me, everyone's trying to get the coronavirus vaccine, and some people have been wanting to find ways to cut the line. I was happy enough to get it this week without cutting the line. But before that, several weeks ago, a woman I know in her 80s who lives in an apartment building that was giving out the coronavirus to people and their loved ones, she actually said to me, "You could just pretend to be my maid."
Oh my God.
So can you imagine me, I hope to think, distinguished, successful professor pretending to be some white woman's maid in order to get the coronavirus vaccine. But these stereotypes are so deep. And, we talk about white ignorance and white privilege. And I just recently began reading this paper by I think it's Michael Burrows, in which he talks about the white ignorance of Hannah Arendt, trying to explain why did Hannah Arendt say such and think such dismissive things about the Black civil rights movement. She was totally opposed to the idea that the government should mandate integrated schools, for example. But he was saying that her problem in his mind was not personal racism, but white ignorance, which is these structural, deeply embedded traditions which prevent white people from seeing what's in front of their eyes, from seeing the struggles of others, and to seeing the harm that is being done to existing policies and laws. And I think that idea of white ignorance is, along with white privilege, quite a powerful idea for helping us to illuminate what goes on in philosophy, where we're supposed to be the smartest people on earth, but yet we can't imagine or see that the Japanese have philosophy, and that the Nigerians have philosophy, and that the Brazilians have philosophy. We cannot see it, we cannot imagine it, because our epistemic structures prevent us from going there with our brains. We cannot epistemically disabled by racism from being able to see and to learn and to believe.
So true, just so true.
Yeah, great. Well, I think we've sort of had a really good discussion about why philosophy is racist, and sort of like the different facets of the racism within Western philosophy. I guess, and I think this is sort of like the real, I think it's sort of the real sort of bulk of the disagreement between you all is how do we go about sort of solving that racism within Western philosophy? Bryan, if you'd like to start off with sort of like what you think your solution is to being able to overcome the racism within Western philosophy.
Yeah, sorry for lowering my camera, but I thought people in the middle of a pandemic can always use a nice picture of a cat.
Absolutely.
So I wanted to share the kitty on my lap.
And the loaf of bread.
Yeah, little kitty loaf, a little kitty loaf. So yes, I mean, one thing I'd like to at least bring up and see what my fellow professors think about this is sometimes I get students who say, well, I see what you're saying, but the thing is, I really like Kant, or I really like Aristotle. And just from my own perspective, what I stress is, I'm not saying you can't like the aspects of Kant that can be disentangled from his racism. When it comes to epistemology, I think of myself as a neo-Kantian. I go back and forth between thinking, no, Hegel's right, ultimately. And Hegel also is, by the way, a major figure in making sure that Indian and South Asian philosophy was excluded from the canon. He felt kind of threatened by it because the monism that some Indian philosophers defend was a little too close to his own view, and he didn't want the competition. So he's part of the movement that gets South Asian philosophy excluded from the canon. But epistemologically, I'm torn between thinking Hegel's right and thinking Kant's right when it comes to broadly epistemological issues. And I think Aristotle is insightful about many aspects of human virtue, despite the fact that he's at least sexist, if not misogynistic, and also, you know, gave one of the most influential defenses of slavery that continued to be cited and continues to have influence even to the present day. So I think we can admire what's right about thinkers in the Anglo-European tradition and acknowledge, for example, the sexism in the Chinese philosophical tradition, which I study. We can be open-minded about, have open eyes about these things while also studying these traditions. But what I recommend is, I often recommend activism. And so I tell students, look, ask your philosophy department to teach classes on Chinese philosophy. If you need the arguments, I mean, I've written books and my colleagues have written books that'll give you plenty of arguments on these topics. And if they won't do it, start petitions. If the petitions don't work, go to the deans, go to the presidents, go to the board of trustees. If that doesn't work, well, maybe it's time to start occupying offices, because we need to put pressure on philosophy departments to expand their curriculum. Now, personally, I'm hearing, it seems I'm noticing a sea change in attitudes among undergraduates, graduate students, and many assistant professors in philosophy, where people, to me, seem more open-minded about these issues than earlier generations were. So I think in some ways, I'm cautiously optimistic. But if you ask me what to do, I'd say put pressure on departments to teach these courses and to hire people to teach them. That would be my recommendation.
I mean, Charles and Anita, what do you think about sort of like this multicultural approach in sort of helping to overcome the racism within Western philosophy? Do you think that the multicultural approach is sort of like the best way to overcome that problem, or do you think actually adopting a multicultural approach may sort of lead to comparative philosophy, and we may stop actually doing philosophy, if that makes sense? We may be more concerned with sort of like the differences between these different traditions and stuff like that, and how they interact with one another, rather than actually doing philosophy. I just wanted to see what you guys thought, and or you as well, Brian. Yeah.
I certainly think that could be part of it, and should be part of it. What I'd like to add, though, is that there's a danger of ghettoization. So in other words, one enters a department and you're not necessarily overtly informed of this, but there's going to be sort of tacit communication to you. Okay, there are the real philosophy courses, there are the core courses, and there's this other stuff which we've been pressured to include. So you're a smart guy, we think you have a bright future. So make sure you focus on the real stuff, and even if you have to do one or two of these other ones, sort of satisfy whatever departmental or campus-wide committees there are. So what I'd like to add is that I think, to the extent that there are white allies out there, and I hope they are, because if they're not, we're in bad shape considering how white the profession is. So if there's a cohort, a sort of critical mass of white allies out there, they could supplement this with the incorporation of such materials into quote unquote regular courses. So in other words, it shouldn't be the case that, okay, you get exposure to these materials in these sort of explicitly designated or, or pretty well designated sort of multicultural courses, but you're doing history of philosophy. And lo and behold, there's, segments on, these philosophies from, other countries, or even within your own country, like in American philosophy, they're in a sort of crucial representatives of the Black American tradition, Native American tradition, et cetera, et cetera. So there's that kind of thing where you have what are sort of seen as unmarked. So they're supposed to be unmarked courses. And the idea is that's different from the multicultural courses. And unmarked really cashes out into sort of orthodox white male. So, what do you do with a history of philosophy course to diversify it? Well, you read around and you see all the other people who could regard as contributing to the history of philosophy. Metaphysics, we'll think of the whole area of social ontology, or the work that's being done there by feminists, by people of color. Epistemology, think of the development of social epistemology, critical social epistemology that looks at issues of race and gender. So there are all kinds of possibilities. And a lot of the time, it just comes out of a certain unwillingness to recognize how narrow and straitened people's conception of the curriculum is, when in fact there's all this exciting material. And people sometimes think of it as an imposition, whereas in fact it could be seen as a way of opening things up and actually making the courses more interesting and exciting. So rather than the same canon that has been taught for decades and decades, somehow we can have all these other sources that you then get into an interesting dialogue with the mainstream people, and then spark an intellectual debate, stimulating student interest, et cetera, et cetera. So I'd want to see that as part of the story as well, the incorporation of quote unquote multicultural materials in what are currently seen as regular, mainstream, traditional core courses.
And in doing that, we have to be very careful that we don't end up letting people off the hook too easily. So we don't want, say, a professor of epistemology to think that there's just one thing written by a person of color that I have to include that thing in my course. And to that I'm going to be safe, right? Check that box, right? You really want scholars of all different backgrounds to thoroughly engage the contributions to their discipline that have been made by people from different backgrounds and different societies. So it has to be a genuine engagement with the material. And I fear that what happens instead is that someone like someone who's not accustomed to teaching diversely or non-exclusively will come to someone like a Charles Mills or a Bryan or an Anita and say, what's a thing? What reading can I assign? And what thing can I? They want a little 2-page or 3-page something to stick in that course. They don't really want to engage the thought of people of other backgrounds.
Yeah.
And that's a problem. And I also think, so I have a couple of other different ways to think about this. I mean, one of the things I think about is I'm really happy to see the growth of public philosophy in general in the US and abroad, where philosophers are now legitimately and openly and with great appreciation engaging the sciences, the politics, government, the professions actively. And so that philosophy's value is being seen as broader than just to other philosophers sitting in the faculty lounge talking to one another. I think this creates opportunity for non-white philosophers. I think it also enriches our institutions and enriches our society. And I do think that would be a useful thing to encourage. I think that we have to encourage everyone to retell the story of their disciplines, so that, for example, it was mentioned in my introduction that I'm an expert on privacy law and the philosophy of privacy. It's actually my main area of expertise. And I've begun to retell the story of the origins of privacy law. The traditional story is that Louis Brandeis and some guy named Samuel Warren wrote an article in 1890 in the Harvard Law Review proposing the existence of a right to privacy. And that was the beginning of privacy law. But what I've begun to do is to look at earlier manifestations of privacy law in the United States. And so there's a very interesting case involving a Black enslaved woman named Lydia, who was trying to escape from a man to whom her slave master had hired her out. This man was trying to beat her for some trivial something, and he shot her. And as she was trying to escape, fortunately for her, the white society decided to prosecute the man for assault, but his conviction was overturned by the North Carolina Supreme Court. A slave-holding judge argued that because of the privacy of the master-slave relationship, we could not interfere with the discipline of slaves by white men. And then that same idea was used 20 years later in a case involving a white man who beat his wife, and the court once again said, because of the privacy of marriage, we cannot interfere with the man beating his wife. And so long before privacy was used as a way to deal with the problem of camera technology and mass-produced newspapers, privacy was being used legally in the United States as a weapon against enslaved people and women. And so you have to tell the story of your discipline, right? Not from the point of view of its traditional starting point, which might be to glorify and validate bourgeois white male society, but there may be other places to start the story that are equally valid, if not more valid. And we got to find those beginning points and teach that thing, right? Teach that thing.
Good. Okay. I guess this is another question that I have for Anita. So, I mean, for the audience who don't know, Anita Allen, she put out this question of, what value does Western philosophy hold for Black women? And someone called Chrissy Dotson, she sort of tried to reply in a paper called "How is this paper philosophy?" I just wanted to ask, has that sort of response changed your outlook on Western philosophy and the value that it does or doesn't hold for Black women? And do you think that Christie's sort of shift away from a culture of justification as sort of being behind philosophy towards a culture of praxis being behind philosophy, do you think that's sort of the solution that would make Western philosophy more valuable for Black women?
So thank you for that question. I want to say something very positive and optimistic about philosophy as part of this otherwise, I think, rather critical and challenging conversation, which is that I was 2 years ago, much to my surprise, elected the president of the American Philosophical Association Eastern Division. Thank you, Charles, for your help with that. And it was a great moment for me. And I used my year as president to go around the country giving talks about the importance of not just inclusion in philosophy, but also of my substantive interest in digital life and in the philosophy of digital life. So I think I used my year well. That happened, that finally a Black woman was elected president of a division of the APA was, I think, a big deal. And it made me, of course, have to say, well, yeah, things have changed. Would I go change the advice that I give to young women about philosophy? Yes and no. First of all, a lot of Black women, like myself, love traditional philosophy. I mean, I love reading Cicero. I love reading Schopenhauer. I love reading so many. I mean, I as a teenager, I started reading philosophy as a teenager, and I loved especially the existentialists, the phenomenologists, the great essayists, your Francis Bacon's of the world. I loved traditional philosophy, but my advice to young people who come to me saying, should I become a philosophy professor? Should I pursue philosophy? I am very cautious because there are many, many valuable roles that talented young Black women and men can perform in our society. They can be anything from a hedge fund superstar to a wonderful a politician in their community, to a parent, to a lawyer, to a doctor, to an engineer. Philosophy is just one job that people can have. And in order for, I was arguing, in order for philosophy to be a legitimate important and useful and recommendable role for us, philosophy has to treat us well. And so I think that philosophy treating us well means realizing that we do have options. They need us more than we need it. And that was what that I didn't realize how radical and controversial that statement was going to be, but it really did spark this whole sort of conversation. You mean, we have to, maybe they don't deserve us, that they need to justify why we should want to be one of them, as opposed to our trying to defend our suitability and intelligence to them to be part of their club. I just sort of flipped the tables. So I still, to some extent, give that kind of cautious advice. Make sure that if you want to do this, take this low-paying, low-status job that you actually, are in love with it. The move about praxis, I think, is a very important move, and it's a move that I've actually lived in my own life. So for me, what makes being a philosopher a rewarding career is not just that I'm a philosopher able to teach philosophy classes and have an affiliation with a philosophy department, but it's that I get to do stuff in the world, that I've combined my passion for philosophy, my love of philosophy, with my legal credential, which gives me the ability to do stuff in the world, to be an advocate, to help people in need, to be on important government commissions and boards, and to do work in the world that ideally makes the world a better place. And I wish I could do a lot more, but I spend so much time outside of the university, outside of the classroom, working on nonprofit boards and with government, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So if philosophers can find ways to find a practical application for their work, and to not just exist entirely in the world of theory and entirely within the scope of the university, and to marshal ideas to improve lives, to address the problem of the overcriminalization of Black lives, or to address the problem of the over-surveillance of Black lives, or to address the problems of persistent poverty, and to address the problem of inadequate health care for people of color. And if you can somehow use your philosophy knowledge and interest and passion in ways that can be turned practical. And I think that's a very good thing to do. Now, when I say practical and praxis, I don't just mean talking praxis. I mean doing something concrete. Then I think philosophy is wonderful. And one of the things I've done, much to the chagrin of some of my colleagues, is I have encouraged so many of my philosophy graduate students to get a joint degree in something else that enables them to turn their talents, to amplify their talents, right? Now, some people who don't have other disciplines and other degrees that enable them to work in the real world and in the outside world, the academies, real world too, are so great at mentorship and scholarship. They write those mind-altering books like the Racial Contract that Professor Mills wrote, that they've done their practice thing simply by being amazingly impactful philosophers. But from the typical philosopher, we don't have the ability to reshape the thinking of our discipline. So having these practical skills that enable us to work in the world and use our knowledge to help further practical goals and concerns, that I think is very, very worthwhile. So I think that that's how I have come to reconcile. So I'm still skeptical of whether philosophy is a good career for Black women, but I think there are ways for Black women to be philosophers that really are exciting, and I can get excited about helping my students to find those paths for themselves by using their gifts and talents and interests.
Thank you. That was very lovely. I mean, we kind of have sort of just touched upon this a little bit, but this is an open question for everyone. What do you all think about this idea of abandoning justification and instead sort of like switching to this idea of praxis as a norm for philosophy?
Well, I'll take a stab at it and say, when the traditions that I know the best, include the Anglo-European tradition, the East Asian philosophical traditions. I know the Indian and South Asian traditions, not quite as well, but a bit. And I've dabbled in Africana and Indigenous American philosophy. I find that issues of justification come up in all these traditions. But I think what we forget is when you're comparing traditions, all of a sudden, mainstream philosophers think that philosophy has to be done in strict deductive syllogisms from absolutely undeniable premises. At that point, all of a sudden, they're ultra rigorous. Now, when you're teaching Aristotle, you're actually teaching Plato, what you realize is you're dealing with texts that, especially in the case of Plato, are very literary, use irony, have to be approached as literary texts. And you're not finding either in Plato or Aristotle, most of the time, things that are in nice syllogistic arguments. There's a lot of digging that you have to do. You've got to think carefully about what they mean. You have to reconstruct arguments. When I read Confucian philosophers like Mengzi or Taoist philosophers like Zhuangzi, or I'm reading the Bhagavad Gita or the Nyaya Sutras, yeah, I have to dig sometimes to figure out, look, what's the structure of the argument here? What does this technical term mean? But I find I'm using the same skills I use when I'm reading Plato or Aristotle. What annoys me is the double standard, where people will throw the Nicomachean Ethics, which is a really hard book to read. They'll throw that to 18-year-olds and say, here, be logical like this, and you just, and then Aristotle saying things like, oh, well, pleasure can't be your goal in life because pleasure is like the bloom on the cheek of a youth. And they're saying, oh, we have to be like Western philosophy, which is all rigorous. Yeah, pleasure is like the bloom on the cheek of a youth. That's really rigorous, Aristotle. And then I read, let's say, the Mohists in the Chinese tradition, and they're giving almost game theoretically precise arguments for impartial caring. Or Mengzi is giving thought experiments and reductio ad absurdum arguments. So I find rigor in all these various traditions, but I think that what counts as rigor and the ways in which philosophers argue are much more diverse than people like to admit when they're doing comparative thought. Because when they're actually doing Western thought, they realize things are very fluid. But when it comes to comparison, all of a sudden they act like everything in the Western canon is strict syllogisms when almost none of it actually is.
Right. Yeah. So justification, the sense of logically rigorous deductive thinking, it's interesting because another important function that philosophers have always had for me is just illumination, right? So it may not be that I get a valid deductive argument out of something that I'm poring over, but rather that I just feel that I better understand a problem or a concept or an issue. And it may be because of the mention of a bloom of a cheek, as opposed to because of some, modus ponens or modus tollens, sort of argument that I just read. And I think the philosophy that I was drawn to, and that so many people of color actually are drawn to, is the more literary style of philosophy. That's just why I think so many African-American philosophers are drawn to existentialism, to critical approaches to philosophy, where it's not just about, boom, boom, boom. It's a much more literary, clarifying, illuminating style of writing that is not about, the magic doesn't come in the logic. The magic comes in the ability to clarify and ultimately to persuade, which can be happening by affecting your emotions as well as by affecting your sort of logical, rational faculties. I actually tell my students these days that they should, when they write, they should just write. A partner in the law firm once told me that the way to write a brief is first you write the brief and then you find the law. And I think there's something to be said for that in philosophy too, is that first you write the philosophy and then you find the arguments to support it, right? Because if you just sit around trying to make justificatory arguments all the time, it may be very hard to say what you mean, to say what you feel, and to say what you know. But if you just say what you know and say what you think and what you feel, it may be the case that then finding an argument to defend those things is much easier. So put the end first and then find the means. I mean, the logic is a means, it's not an end, it's a means, right? And so I would make that suggestion to people as a way of, first of all, not self-censoring, because sometimes if you can't defend it, you think you can't say it. Say it, and then try to defend it and do your best. And the process of philosophy becomes a sort of public exercise of trying to defend what one asserts is true and what one believes, and realizing that there may be complexities to doing that, right? And that's okay. And I love that kind of philosophy that's sort of driven by the sense of the problems needing to be solved. And I also apply this in my thinking about my work in privacy, which is that, you know, for such a long time, the philosophical literature about privacy would start with these Oxford, Cambridge style attempts to define what privacy means. And then you define what privacy means, and then you try to apply it to the real world. And oh my God, you discover that the Supreme Court is talking nonsense, because what they think privacy means is not what our philosophical analysis tells us it really means. But my recent rejoinder to that entire tradition has been that let's start with the problems we want to solve. So the problem may be that there's an over surveillance of Black people in minority communities in the United States or in England, right? There's a ban on wearing modesty clothing in France. We want to address that problem. Let's think about definition in a way which I call critical facilitation. So first you define the problem you want to solve, the thing you want to focus on, right? Violations of the Fourth Amendment that lead to the murder of a Breonna Taylor. And then you ask yourself, if I want to solve that problem, to fix it so that the cops are less likely to murder a woman in her own home who's not committed a crime, what definition of privacy would I need to get that work done? And that's how we think about what privacy means. Because on some level, we know what privacy means, but it may well be that in order to affect a new law, to have a new piece of legislation passed, we need a little definition we can put in the legislation. But don't let the problem of definition prevent you from addressing the problem, and don't let the problem be deprived of the passionate language of privacy, that warm and important language of privacy, because you can't define the term. So I think that sometimes, like putting the practical problem before the conceptual analysis is the way to go to make philosophy useful and to make it more responsive to the actual concerns of the world.
There's a way in which I think Augustine had an insight that the older I get and the more philosophy I do, I think it's really important. Augustine said that we can't just talk about your rationality and your passions. We have to talk about the orientation of your will. And the orientation of your will is more fundamental than your rationality and your passions. And the reason I think that's so important, he's bringing it up in connection with belief in God. But you can use your rationality and your passions for good or evil. It just depends on what you've decided with your will. Whose side are you going to be on is going to determine how rationality and your passions function for you. So I recently got into an argument on Twitter with someone who's got a PhD in philosophy. He does philosophy of language. And he was explaining to me why he doesn't like the slogan Black Lives Matter. And he said, well, I don't like the slogan Black Lives Matter because it logically entails that other lives do not matter. And I said, if someone said, that's the right response, but that is exactly the right response. And I said to him, what really struck me was, I said to him, so if someone said tomatoes are fruits, would you think that logically entailed that apples and oranges are not fruits? Or would you think a person was just foregrounding an ignored fact, which is that tomatoes are also fruits? And he said, that's a really good point. I'd never thought of that before. So here's someone who's got a PhD in the philosophy of language, and an objection that ought to be obvious to any bright 12-year-old didn't occur to him. And that's because the orientation of his will was already in the wrong direction. So a man who must have had some level of intelligence to get a PhD in philosophy, couldn't see an obvious objection to a view that he was publicly discussing. And why does that happen? I'm increasingly puzzled by people who seem to otherwise be intelligent, who say things that seem like anyone with minimal intelligence could get that, but it's a failure of the orientation of the will. And if I can say one last thing about that, if you look at the history of the analytic tradition, which resulted in people like this colleague, a lot of early analytic philosophers or their antecedents among the logical positivists like Carnap and Russell, they were politically quite progressive. You know, Russell was fighting for women's suffrage. You know, he was fighting for people's married couples' right to use birth control, or for the legitimacy of divorce if people were unhappy. And Carnap was, you know, an early socialist. So these early analytic thinkers were very politically progressive for their eras. You know, and so something changed about the tradition. So I think you can write in an analytic style that's sympathetic to issues of race and class and gender, or you can write in a continental style. Pick the style that speaks to you, and don't be put off just because there are people who now occupy the tradition who are, for one reason or another, ignorant or blind to these issues.
Mm. You know, I spent a couple of summers of my life teaching in Japan, and it's great. It's a great experience teaching in Japan. I wish I could do more of that kind of work. But there was a book written by a Western bioethicist about abortion policy in Japan, and this person was saying that, oh, you know, there's no controversy about abortion in Japan. Everybody just accepts it because they have you know, had a policy of birth control pills being not trusted, and so abortion was the standard means of birth control. And there's just no issue about abortion in Japan. So, but when I went to Japan and I started to visit temples and shrines and see so many of these little statues, are called jizos, which are little statues. Sometimes they'd be wearing a little bib. Sometimes they'd be have toys or candy around them. And I learned about the jizos, which are often erected by people who have lost a child or have had an abortion. And then I made a very long journey to a little small town in Japan called Chichibu, where there's a whole mountainside covered with thousands, if not by now, a million or more of these little Jesus, where women and families go to erect a little Jesus as a memorial to an aborted fetus. And I thought, boy, you know, this is a lot more complicated than that book written by that American, you know, would make one think. And I think that there's so much in the world like that. And I so appreciate scholars who have tried to open our eyes about the ways in which we don't understand other cultures from superficial glances, and the respects in which, if we dig a little bit deeper, something richer and more meaningful may come out of our experience with other cultures. So I just, you know, that's just one little anecdote, but I just find that it's so, when I have been able to, been privileged to have some extended exposure to other cultures and to try to get inside the thinking, the philosophy, the ethics of those other societies, it's really been very, very illuminating. Something similar happened to me with Singapore, where you know, you hear all the time about, you know, about Singapore not having civil rights in the same way that we have them, and being a, you know, repressive society. But the time that I've spent trying to learn about Singaporean law in my discipline, it's a much more complicated story than you might think. I feel actually wounded and offended that I was deprived as a student from having any knowledge of non European philosophy. I feel deprived, and like, here I am, 67 years old, and still I don't have the knowledge that I wish I had and should have of non-Western philosophy. And then one more thing about this. When I was a student, I was very interested in the German language, and I studied a little bit in Germany. And when I was going to Germany, I decided to make a project of reading Heidegger. So I was walking around Germany for 3 months carrying Heidegger under my arm. I had no idea that Heidegger was a Nazi sympathizer. Why didn't, as part of my, am I being taught Heidegger by my philosophy professors? Why wasn't I taught the context of Heidegger's thought and about Heidegger the man? This is something we need to fix in philosophy, teaching these philosophers as if they're disembodied spirits, right? Instead of full-blooded people who exist within cultures, because it was greatly, not just embarrassing to me, but it was actually dangerous for me to be walking around carrying Heidegger in 1973 in Germany. So we need to address that too, like just the way we teach it, the way we teach our own, let alone non-Western philosophy, but do we teach Western philosophers in a way that really uncovers the depth of their own colonialisms, racisms, sexisms, etc., so that our students really understand these people and don't unduly revere them or revere them inappropriately, because that's a mistake. That's really a mistake.
Brilliant. In which case, I think that's probably quite an appropriate place to sort of end the actual panel discussion. I mean, yeah, it was honestly, it was really great speaking to you guys. I'll just open up the floor to any questions from the audience. So if anyone has any questions, just feel free to put them in the chat, and then I'll convey them to the panelists. I guess in the meantime, one question that I do have is, I mean, I think we have, again, sort of touched upon this lightly, but some people might argue, to what extent does the racism of, okay, you know, Kant's racism, fair enough, you know, he was instrumental in sort of like our modern conception of race or whatever, fair enough, his racism was important, but, you know, to what extent does the anti-Semitism of Frege, to what extent does that matter to sort of his philosophy, or why should we actually be bothered about sort of, you know, racism in situations where it doesn't necessarily apply to the philosophy of the philosophers? So yeah, so that's an open question for anyone.
I think that's a great question. I don't think there's a one size fits all answer. Right? So I think it's useful to know that Frege was anti-Semitic, because it's a reminder of the fact that people who are otherwise quite intelligent and creative can have very bad aspects to their character. As far as I can tell, it doesn't invalidate, you know, I'm not particularly a Fregean, you know, more in the closer to the Davidsonian tradition on this, but still, I wouldn't say that the reason I'm not a Fregean is because Frege was a Nazi. But it's used even in that case where there may not be a connection between his abhorrent personal beliefs and his philosophy. It's worth reminding ourselves that smart people can have abhorrent views, because we tend to ignore that. For other cases like Russell, I mean, Russell was a hero of mine growing up, although I've moved away from his philosophical position a lot. But I think if Russell were around today, I think he would definitely have gotten in trouble for sexual harassment. But part of the reason it's worth bringing that up is it makes us think about the fact that Russell was also kind of a hero in fighting to modernize attitudes towards premarital sex and divorce, and the use of birth control, which was actually more controversial in mainstream society when he was writing than it was later. And so it helps to point out the complexity of these issues, that, you know, what is sexual liberation, and reminding ourselves that in advocating sexual liberation, we need a model that doesn't privilege a male perspective on that, and the dangers of a naive conception of sexual liberation. So sometimes that can be useful. I mean, Heidegger's Nazism, I mean, this is a complicated issue. There are aspects of Heidegger's thought that I really admire, that I think are not contaminated by, his association with Nazism, but it is worth considering whether there's some sort of deep connection there. And personally, whenever I teach Aristotle, I always at least advert to his defense of slavery and his sexism, because they're so historically influential. I feel like I wouldn't be doing my job as a historian of philosophy if I didn't make students aware of the fact that this was part of his influence as well. So I think it depends on the author, how you foreground it and how much you think it affects their philosophy, and how you want to incorporate it into teaching them. That would be my 2 cents on that.
Mm-hmm. If the philosopher is dead, it's one thing. If they're alive, so there can in a sense be a distinction between the content of their views and their being homophobic or anti-Semitic or racist or sexist. But when they're a living, breathing part of our philosophical community, and you have students and colleagues who would have personal encounters with the philosopher, I think it's hard to not think it doesn't matter that they happen to be, an anti-Semite or a racist or a sexist or homophobe, because it matters in terms of our attempt to build an intellectual community. But again, if the person's dead, then it's easier to say that we can, mark it and move on. But if they're alive, it becomes much more significant in terms of who they teach, what they're allowed to teach, what they're invited to, what they're not invited to, who they mentor, who they shouldn't mentor. All these kinds of questions become very much alive. And we have seen cases in our own recent times where we do worry about the fact that some people on our faculties of philosophy and cognate fields may be people that we think cannot do an adequate job of educating all of their students because of their biases, prejudices, and hatreds, really.
There's a complication also. I certainly take Professor Allen's point about the difference between those living and those dead. With those dead, there's a complication that arises in the following fashion. I'm very much in agreement with Professor Van Norden that you should try to retrieve the valuable parts of the person's thought, and you should not take the view, which I think many younger people do. There's a kind of purism. This person was a racist. Well, that's it. I'm not interested in a single other thing this person has to say. Probably if you apply that criteria unsuccessfully, there's not going to be much left in the canon. If you add sexism to it, there's going to be virtually nothing. So, the attempt to retrieve the positive parts of their thought that have not been contaminated by the racism and sexism. But there's a problem that Robert Bernasconi has pointed out with respect to Kant in particular, that I think he would believe it applies to other people as well, which is that you sort of give a token mention of the racism and sexism. You then say something like, well, the theory isn't really affected. Yeah, he said these things, but really. And you then move on. And what you end up with is, in a sense, the issue is not addressed, because you're then treating Kant as if he never said any of these things. So a kind of complicated operation, I think, is involved theoretically, where you have to both point out how the racism and sexism affects his thought, and then if you're trying to retrieve Kant, as I've been trying to do in my own work, you then show, well, this retrieved Kant is not really the same as the actual Kant. Now, it might seem kind of problematic to be continually scare quoting Kant from then on. So what would Kant have said? What would Kant have said? But it does sort of, make people more self-conscious that we can't just give the actual historical Kant, credit for all kinds of stuff, because you could then have a situation where you get a feminist Kant, you get an anti-racist Kant. I myself have written an essay, Black Radical Kantianism, and it then turns out Kant was such a progressive guy in all kinds of ways, and he's been travestied, he's been characterized wrong, when really he's this brother down with the sisters and the people of color. So the retrieval operation has to be carried out delicately in such a way as to say, we're doing this, but let's not forget that the actual Kant thought these things.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. I mean, I can't really see any of the questions in the chat, so I'm just gonna narrow on a little bit and just sort of ask my own questions once I've got the opportunity. I mean, do you think perhaps the solution just going forward is to basically just to abandon any sort of a notion of ahistoricality and sort of incorporate historical context in philosophy moving forward? Because I think do you think sort of having historical context will inform us whether the racism was relevant to the works and stuff like that? So yeah, do you think incorporating historical context is the solution, I guess?
Well, I certainly think that including the historical context is part of the solution. I also think that we should be careful about too quickly concluding that the racist, homophobic, colonialist, sexist thinking of the person has nothing to do with their philosophy. Because one of the reasons why it's important to have people who look like me and Charles and who write like Bryan in the room is because we sometimes see connections that may not be obvious to everybody. Sometimes you bring a perspective from your study of different kinds of philosophy and your own demographic experience. You bring that to bear in a text, and you might see that there actually is a way in which the person's being an anti-Semite affects their epistemology, or their being a racist affects their ontology. And I think that ability to see those connections and to encourage students to be open to those connections, we should go there first. So before we say, oh yeah, was a racist, but no connection, let's actually invite careful readings of text that might show that there is a connection, right, between these two types of things. Maybe the lack of openness to corrective justice might actually be there because of the concerns about the politics of corrective justice that might favor minorities in a particular real world context. So I just think that it's exciting to me to not make the conclusion that there's no connection, but to rather be open to the possibility that in ways that are very subtle, there is a connection.
And actually, picking up on Professor Allen's point, Dutch philosopher Pauline Kleingeld has two important essays on Kant. Kant's second thoughts on colonialism and Kant's second thoughts on race. And they're controversial in that other Kant scholars, like Robert Bernstein I just mentioned, would say, well, that there are no second thoughts, that this radical change you're talking about is misleading. But the point I wanted to make is that she does draw the connection. She says, look, Kant has these racist views, and you can then see them manifest in the stuff he says or does not say about slavery, about colonialism, so that in fact, the connection is often more clear-cut than we'd think, but that sometimes it's in texts that are not part of the sort of standard assigned ones. So, the student doesn't get the sort of full sense. This goes back to Professor Allen's point that, okay, here's a sort of prepackaged, sanitized Heidegger, Kant, whomever, and then there's all this other stuff. And once you read the other stuff, your eyes are open. Whoa, I didn't realize you could make all those links. But in some cases, the links are actually there already, in the person's other writings that are not so much sort of, regularly assigned as part of the standard canon.
Yeah, I think these are all excellent points. Just to throw out some resources, Professor Allen was talking about, wanting to learn more about traditions that aren't commonly taught in the contemporary Western academy. And one website I really enjoy is Reading the China Dream. That's if you just write that out, readingthechinadream.com. And that's a collection of translations from contemporary Chinese writers from a variety of different political perspectives, from the most steadfast pro-government to Confucian critiques of the contemporary Chinese Communist government and various kind of liberal critiques. And it's really fascinating to read. And I read Chinese, but I read slowly. So even for me, it's very useful to have this resource. And then I can also assign these things to students. Just to throw it out there, one thing that I've been fascinated by recently is there's a number of students who I thought of in China, Chinese students in China, who I thought of as very well-meaning and well-directed, who are huge fans of Donald Trump. And it's because they're buying into this narrative they're hearing from conservatives in the United States, that the United States political conflict is between communists and people who actually believe in democracy and liberty. And then they buy into this propaganda. And on the Reading the China Dream website, there's I'm not going to remember the entire citation, but there's an article there by a liberal Chinese thinker talking about this strange trend and critiquing it. But it just gives you a sense of things you would never expect, that the opposition in China, there's a wing of it that's very pro-Trump, because they're hearing a certain kind of propaganda and a way of framing political debates in the US. That was a fascinating read for me. And if I can be forgiven a moment of self-promotion, I also maintain on my website, bryanvannorden.com, I maintain a bibliography of what I call the less commonly taught philosophies. And there's a list of translations of primary sources, introductory textbooks, and secondary works on, among other things, Africana, South Asian, East Asian, and Indigenous American philosophies, if people want to learn more about those topics and they're not offered at the institution where they're studying. So again, that's bryanvannorden.com, Bryan with a Y, VANNORDEN.com.
Excellent, thank you.
Brilliant. I do have a question from my old philosophy teacher, actually, so I do need to ask this, otherwise he might be a little bit upset. So he's asking, how would you advise examining bodies or schools, so not necessarily universities, but examining bodies or schools that teach philosophy to 16 to 18-year-olds? How do you advise them to perhaps change curriculum to reflect global philosophy and sort of challenge the canon of Western dominated philosophy? So,
I'll start out. I guess there's an old saying, "Fools go where angels fear to tread." So I'll start with try to answer that question. I mean, again, I've been fighting for so long to try to get philosophy departments to teach anything outside the Anglo-European mainstream that I'm just delighted when they're willing to teach anything. So, but I think if you're again, there are I've got syllabi on my website. If someone, it's always better to have a specialist if you have one, but there are people who routinely teach Plato and Aristotle who don't read classical Greek. There are people who routinely teach, Descartes, Spinoza, and Kant who don't read German or Latin or early French. And so if there's a student desire, there are textbooks you can order to teach a nice intro level course in Chinese philosophy. And like I say, if you like Aristotelian virtue ethics, and you should be able to teach Mengzi's Confucian virtue ethics. If you're interested in skeptical writings or writings that try to undermine a mainstream philosophical tradition, and you like thinkers like Nietzsche, for example, you should be able to teach the Taoist Zhuangzi. If you like Aquinas or Augustine, you should be able to teach Neo-Confucian philosophers like Zhu Xi and Wang Yangming. There are translations available of these works. If you're interested in epistemology and metaphysics, there's a great new translation of Nyaya philosophy out from Hackett Publishing. It's an anthology of works, and Nyaya philosophy it's an easy stepping stone if you're used to teaching figures like Descartes and Kant and Hume. It's an easy stepping stone to teach Indian Nyaya philosophy. I love the Bhagavad Gita. I've taught that a bunch of times. It's a more literary work. It's a philosophical poem, but it's a fascinating one. And the arguments for monism that you get in that work are very reminiscent of Parmenides' arguments for monism, and that's combined with an interesting ethical view. So these are some things that I think anybody could start teaching these areas without a lot of, you don't need to know it's always great to know the primary language, but you don't need to, just like you don't need to read classical Greek to teach Plato, although it certainly helps.
There are experts on pre-college philosophy in the United States, and perhaps through the American Philosophical Association website, you could find links to how to get in touch with the groups that do specialize in pre-college philosophy. I was just a couple of weeks ago approached by a website called Edutopia to opine on the teaching of philosophy to high school students. And, it's not an area that I'm an expert on at all. And I've never taught pre-college philosophy at all. But I do think that the idea here of introducing younger and younger people to philosophy is not a bad idea, but doing it well is I think quite a challenge. But because I myself began reading philosophy when I was about 12 or 13, I do think that there's a there, and that lots of young people are craving to have an opportunity to engage philosophical texts and ideas.
Brilliant. Right. I don't really think there's any more questions in the chat either. I think they've mostly been answered. So I think that might be a time to sort of call this panel discussion to an end. But honestly, it was really great having you all for this panel discussion. I know that I've certainly learned a lot, and from the chat, it appears as though my high school teachers have certainly learned quite a lot as well from this discussion. I just before everyone leaves, I'd just like to promote the next event for PPE Society. It will be happening next week, and it will be a panel discussion on China and what its foreign policy ambitions are going forward post the COVID-19 pandemic. Again, I just want to say a really big thank you to Bryan and Anita and Charles for joining us, because this has been a dream come true, definitely.
Thank you for
Thank you
organizing.
for the invitation.
Thank you very much. It was very enjoyable. Good to
And
see
I
everybody.
predict a brilliant future for you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay.